Hello, Linden. This is Larry Bash again, representing the Bureau of Parks and Recreation in their Senior Citizen Lecture Series. Today is the second in our spring lectures. We have 6 scheduled. You need to go to the city website to get a schedule. Remember that if you miss the scheduled broadcast of any one of these lectures, the city puts it on YouTube, and you can access that on the website also. I would like to remind people to register with Parks and Recreation, their participation in the program. It's important because now that we've switched to a taping of the lecture as opposed to in-person or using a platform that allows for remote participation. We want to send out people supporting materials for each of the lectures, and what we're doing is when people register, we mail them out to everybody. Remember, we don't have an interaction here anymore with face-to-face meetings. So you're welcome to send your questions to me on email. My email, I'll say it again, is Larry Bash, LarryBashe at AOL.com, and I'll answer them in real time, even though you may be watching this after the fact. I will respond to your questions. Often I say to you that the supporting materials are not critical to benefiting from the lecture. But in this case, particularly this subject, today's subject is cybercurrency, or often it's called cryptocurrency. This is a subject that deserves some backup support and information. I've done this in a couple of venues, courses that last 2 or 3 sessions long or shorter lectures, and I'm never sure what the audience is interested in. If they're interested in, they're sort of curious about it because they hear a lot about it, or if they're interested in investing maybe and they want more information. In this lecture, we are giving a very surface treatment of this subject to satisfy people's currency, and if they want to get more information, if you would like a more in-depth lecture in more detail, like for instance on a couple of these venues, I've actually shown people how they can access a platform and invest in cryptocurrency versus just a general information about what it is and what it means for the economy. We could do another lecture on that, or you can do some of the research on your own with the material I'm going to provide to you. But again, you need to register so that we can send it to you. If, for instance, you're not registered, but somehow you want information on any one of the topics, this one or others, you can also email me, and I'll email you back the material for that session. You know, this was a topic that wasn't a high priority in our original. We've had several lectures now, those of you that have been a part of the program. And this was not a high priority topic, cryptocurrency. And I'm assuming that it's gotten more interest because during the pandemic, it's become into greater use. And of course, in any case, we are switching away from traditional currency anyway, and particularly during the pandemic. So maybe people have, and the value has gone up dramatically. So it's possible that people are more interested just because of that. I would also remind you that the next lecture will be scheduled for April 19th. It's in the schedule on the website, and it's going to cover U.S. trade policies, particularly the issue of the use of tariffs in trade wars. And there was a particular interest in focusing particularly on our relationship with China, which has been a matter for a lot of political discussion recently. So again, that is a topic that you could benefit from the supporting material. So again, I recommend people register with Parks and Recreation, and we can send you out the supporting materials. I'd like to approach this topic by first going through a brief history of U.S. currency. It relates to what we're going through now, and I think it's useful to go through that. And it's kind of interesting, and it's instructive about what we're going through now about the use of alternative currencies. The best way, and we've approached this and touched on it in other lectures. We did a lecture on the gold standard, for instance. We had a course on the U.S. economy, and we touched on the issue of currency. So we haven't had an in-depth discussion of alternate currencies, but we have touched on some of these issues before. So for some of us, it'll be a little bit of a refresher on the issue. What I usually start with when we talk about the history of our currency is Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, had a lot of input into the Constitutional Convention and the nature of our U.S. Constitution. He was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers defending and advocating for the approval of the Constitution, along with John Jay and James Madison. And he was very influential in our original setting up of the replacement for the old Articles of Confederation, which were generally critiqued as not giving enough power to the central government, and that dynamic of individual rights versus central government, which was so prevalent then, led to immediately amending the Constitution with the 10 Bill of Rights, all related to individual rights. And it's the Thomas Jefferson faction versus the George Washington, John Adams faction. And Alexander Hamilton definitely fell on the side of more centralized central government. So, amongst the founding fathers, in my opinion, Alexander Hamilton had a much better sense of what are the key issues going forward and a vision for what the country would be like, particularly in the area of finance and economics. He was George Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, and when there were debates internally about issues like the National Bank and things like that, he generally deferred on financial matters to Alexander Hamilton because, as he explained to Thomas Jefferson, look, Alexander Hamilton is my Secretary of the Treasury, you're my Secretary of State. So Thomas Jefferson had a big effect on, having the Constitution amended pretty quickly with the Bill of Rights. But in financial matters, it was mostly Alexander Hamilton. Now, what was his vision, which very much relates to the currency issue? One is he envisioned a currency supported by the gold standard, which was the Great Britain model that he was following, so that there be something in back of the U.S. currency that supports it. And the gold standard was attractive to Alexander Hamilton. And eventually, in the late 1800s, almost all countries went to some version of the gold standard to support their currency. By the end of World War II, the gold standard was not as prevalent, and really the world generally looked to U.S. dollar and U.S. currency as the standard for value when there was fluctuating value of currency. And most of trade issues and global financial issues were based on the value of the U.S. dollar. But in Alexander's mind, the gold standard was important. Gold standard was important in terms of supporting the currency because it guarded against inflation. It limited the ability to borrow, a little bit inflexible in that sense. In other words, you couldn't print more currency than you had gold backing it up. That's been compromised considerably in succeeding centuries, as we're probably familiar with, and we have discussed before in some of our other lectures. So he liked the idea of a gold standard, a precious metal, limited supply, doesn't deteriorate. So once you have it, it stays in its form. And he supported this idea of setting a gold standard behind our currency and setting a value for it and not printing more currency or money than could be supported with by gold that the government was holding. He envisioned a national bank because he felt, for instance, that the federal government should establish some ability to have credit, to be able to borrow in the future when necessary. And he was pretty clever about it because one of his strategies for advocating for approval of the Constitution was he proposed that the federal government cover and pay for all the debts incurred by states in fighting the war for independence, or the American Revolution. That was very attractive to the states that were going to vote on whether they were going to adopt the new replacement for the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution. And the other part of his concept was they'd establish their credit right away by borrowing to cover those costs and then demonstrating that the country had the financial wherewithal to incur debt and meet its debt obligations. He envisioned a national currency, which really didn't happen until the 1860s. So it took a while for some of his ideas to come to fruition. But almost all of his concepts turned out to be the direction the country went in. So there was a national currency established in a Banking Act in the early 1860s. And later, it was a more formal adoption of the gold standard, which is what he advocated for. And really by the late 1800s, most countries were using the gold standard as a standard for backing currency. And it was the standard for valuing the currency that was involved in trade between countries. Interesting thing about the gold standard is that as we discovered more gold, like in the 1840s when the gold rush occurred in California, for instance, as you had more supply of gold, the value went down, and that created further pressure on the inflexibility of the gold standard. And actually, for a period of time during the Civil War, we issued what was called greenbacks, which was money that was printed to help pay the cost of the war that wasn't supported by gold or anything else except the promise to pay. That was gone by the end of the Civil War, and that's the only reason they went to it. And we still have the term greenbacks that is used from time to time, but that's the genesis of it. So Alexander's vision was stated early, and the main opposition to it was later with Andrew Jackson, who opposed the National Bank. The National Bank was incorporated for a 20-year term, was renewed under James Monroe for another 20 years. And when the time came, Andrew Jackson was president and didn't support the renewal and actually took federal money out of the National Bank and put it into state chartered banks. Interestingly enough, those banks he put the money into ended up failing, and it triggered a very bad recession that occurred after Jackson left office during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, led to his failure to win re-election in 1840 and the election of our first Whig president, William Henry Harrison. The issue of currency that came to the forefront during Andrew Jackson's years was the idea of paper money versus hard currency. Jackson was a big advocate for using metals and a hard currency. Ironically enough, he opposed paper currency. This is the man whose picture is now on the $20 bill. He opposed paper money, and he opposed a national bank and a national currency. But later, Hamilton's vision came to fruition, and so by the late 1800s, we were on the gold standard. We had, gone through industrialization, but the issue remained, and the tension remained between, the hard money, tight money philosophy favored by banks and merchants in New England versus multi-metal backing of a currency, the big advocate being William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president 3 times, and his major issue was, if you recall the famous speech, you shall not crucify man on a cross of gold. He was an advocate for silver or multi-metal backing of money. That it was another way to favor inflation, and inflation favored farmers versus the banks and the merchants in New England, and that really was an issue that contributed to the Civil War, in addition to the issue of slavery. It was an issue right up through into the early 1900s. As I said, William Jennings Bryan, he ran for president 3 times, lost 3 times. The last time was to William Howard Taft in 1908, who was the successor to Teddy Roosevelt. So the issue of money, currency, the support for the currency was continued as an issue, and we ended up compromising the gold standard during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a part of a reaction to the Great Depression. He was afraid of a run on gold that people would start, because literally you could turn in currency and get gold back. And the amount of currency outstanding was restricted by the amount of gold you had. And Roosevelt stopped the ability to trade in currency for gold. It was his way of protecting the gold and not having a run on the gold. And it was related to all the economic activities in trying to recover from the recession. By the time we got to into the 70s, when there was a lot of economic dislocation, President Nixon took us off the gold standard, which we discussed at a previous lecture, which created much more flexibility, allowed us to issue more debt, and contributed to more inflation. Remember during the Jimmy Carter years, for instance, the high amount of inflation, high interest rates. So that's the background of the U.S. currency. And as I said, after the war, when the gold standard had been compromised, after World War II, when the gold standard had been compromised, really the U.S. dollar became the standard for value because currency fluctuated in value. And in terms of any kind of world trade, you had to deal with the issue of the different values of currency, and the dollar became the standard that other currencies were valued after. In my days as an investment banker, before I retired, I did a financing for New Jersey Transit in which we used a technique of purchasing rail cars by using a cross-border lease. The rail cars were from Sweden. The cross-border leases were through Germany. And in the process of completing the transaction to get new rail cars, we had to include in the financing currency hedges because we were dealing with 3 different currencies. So you had to accommodate the issue of the floating values of currency, particularly if it was involving trade, by hedging the issue of the value of the currencies involved. So now we come to this issue of alternate currencies. It's the original alternate currency that we refer to as a type of cryptocurrency was Bitcoin. It was 2007, 2008, something like that, in which someone set up this alternate currency. Now, Bitcoin is, which you probably hear a lot about, is, 40, 50% of the market of alternate currency, of cryptocurrencies. There are more being developed and presented and sold and traded along the way, but overwhelmingly the most used cryptocurrency is Bitcoin. Now, remember, there's nothing in back of this. Its value is determined by the fact that they limit the supply. And so if you then can create demand for this alternate currency, the value will go up. And that's the key element in its value. Limiting the supply and the developing markets for using this alternate currency. And the more that it's used, the greater recognition it has, and then the supply limit comes into place and its value goes up. The technique that's used to do transactions in these cyber cryptocurrencies, something called blockchain. If we were meeting together, where I've done this with students present, we've had quite a dialogue, a very engaged dialogue about this concept and how it works. And we don't have that today maybe sometime when we get together again face to face, we can go into this, because there often were questions, and half the time was spent debating this technique and how it works and how it affects the U.S. economy. And it's not a simple concept. The blockchain technology is not limited to dealing with cryptocurrency. It's a computer generated method of storing data, recording transactions, and maintaining a ledger. So it has many uses, but it is the primary source of buying, selling, trading of these alternate currencies. The concept is to create blocks of information and make them secure. The information is encrypted, and make sure that one part of a block doesn't affect another block, and they have to make sure that there's an accurate ledger of the transactions. The attraction of this is there is no central bank, no central authority, no third person that charges fees, or nor is it regulated as a financial transaction, like the money you have in your bank. Your bank is heavily regulated, and it affects what it costs you to use a bank for transactions. This has no third party except for the blockchain process. The blockchain process is attractive because it's like a peer-to-peer trading. It's secure, or to date it's been secure, very secure. It's private. The transaction process is much quicker. There's no delay in completing a transaction, and the record of the transactions are kept and secured and maintained in this blockchain process. Now, a blockchain is a computer-generated system, and there's a whole market that's been created of people that create blockchains. It's not simple. It's very complicated, uses a lot of computer power, but it is a source of income for entrepreneurs who've created these blockchains and then use it to. It's not just for cryptocurrency, but in terms of cryptocurrency, it's a way to implement transactions. Now, along with that, platforms have been developed to do the trading. Robinhood is one of them. We've heard a lot about them recently because of other issues dealing with stock market and shorting of securities, which is a subject for another time, I think. Interesting though, because almost a lot of the best and brightest on Wall Street are now focused on how to manipulate paper to create profit. Not anything that's productive, but just transaction oriented. But there are several platforms. Now, the reason I said I thought that supporting materials might be helpful for this topic is because I will give you a listing of the various platforms and a little analysis of the pros and cons of the different platforms that are used to do that process. Also, I can give you a more in-depth description of the blockchain process, because when I do talk about this, I often get a lot of questions about it, and this conversation is not meant as an in-depth discussion of the use of alternate currencies. It's most of the people that have asked to have this as a subject are curious about how it works and, why is the value going up so much. This is not a forum for discussing how you can invest in the issues you should address in investing in alternate currencies. Although it's very active market and it's getting bigger and bigger. Plus, they're getting more merchants involved in accepting it as payment for different things. Plus, during uncertain times like the pandemic, more and more corporations now are looking at ways to park cash. And one of them has developed with Bitcoin and other digital currencies. But remember, there's nothing behind it. It's total risk. And it only survives if people are willing to use it. And it has developed into a growing market. It's also very volatile, ups and downs based on, if you have a huge transaction where a certain company or a certain investor gets into alternate currency, it often raises the value. We've had in the past 12 months, huge increases in value. Bitcoin is increased in value in the last 12 months by more than 300%. The second highest used, more frequently used alternate currency, called Ether, it has gone up more than that. It's gone up more than 400%. The reason that the value has gone up so dramatically is more and more companies are now starting to use it. It's getting accepted more. The supply is limited. Bitcoin only exists there's only like 21 million Bitcoins. And the supply does not change dramatically. And they have this process called halving, which happens every 4 or 5 years, in which they half the amount in supply of the Bitcoins. Value goes up. But the supply still is limited. And that's true of most of the other alternate currencies also. But if you combine those first two alternate currencies, that's probably 60, 70% of the market. But other currencies are being developed, and their involvement is growing, and they're becoming more accepted. And the blockchain industry has also grown enormously. So it's a very complicated use of computer energy, which is significant. And you may have heard that people can obtain Bitcoin. In addition to the trading, buying, selling, they can mine Bitcoin. And the blockchain industry allows them to earn Bitcoin by basically, I guess you'd say, solving puzzles in this computer network that's whatever this blockchain is, this specific blockchain is. So there is a way to acquire it, but it's controlled by the people that set up these blockchain computer networks, and it's very complicated. A run-of-the-mill person is not going to be able to do that. One of the problems you might anticipate would be liquidity. Well, the more acceptance it has, these alternate currencies, the more liquid they become. The more types of currencies that are developed, the more it's accepted by companies and people, the more of a market there is for it. And some people use it to take care of, do financial transactions. One of the biggest risks here is that it's not really regulated like the banking system is. So there's always the risk that the federal government will get involved in regulating it in some way, which could reduce the value of any of these alternate currencies. There's a lot of concern in our government that it's used for criminal purposes because it's hidden, it's a peer-to-peer process, and so quickly they're able to execute transactions very quickly, and it's private and secure, theoretically. But remember, there's nothing behind it, so it's really total risk. One of the biggest developments last year was PayPal accepted it. Now, I don't know how many of you use PayPal, but that's a growing financial marketplace. And PayPal now accepts Bitcoin. You can buy and sell Bitcoin. You can use it on their site to buy things. So they have 300 million users, 30 million merchants. So they're all now accepting it. And you go about your business, you can see signs that say businesses that will accept Bitcoin. And again, corporations are using it to park cash. But it's still limited in supply, which increases its value. And as an investment, it's still, I'd have to say, very risky. So this is intended to be a brief primer on cryptocurrency. The material that you will receive if you request it, if you register, and if you request it specifically, will show you examples of different platforms in which they're traded, and they'll be evaluated. The different alternate currencies that exist and their values, how the values have fluctuated. We're not able with this medium of the public TV to share documents and show them. So that's something you have to register, and we'll send it to you, or if you ask me directly by my email, I can send you the material. If you want to go in further depth on this topic, that means looking at the blockchain technology, looking at the various alternate currencies, such as Bitcoin and Ether and others that are developing. There's a lot. How they're valued, and the various platforms you use. I mean, one of my courses, we actually did a computer model of how you do a trade on one of the platforms. I think it was Robinhood I used to show people how it works. That's hard for us to do in this forum because we're taping a presentation and we're not face-to-face. Now, again, if more in-depth information is of interest, we can set up a more detailed and sophisticated look at these alternate currencies. I suspect that the reason I was asked to do this by the participants in the program is more out of curiosity. What is it? What am I reading about? How does it work? This is not meant as an in-depth discussion of how you buy, sell, and trade these alternate currencies. But it's, as we've seen, it's a part of a change that's going on in our economy in which there's going to be less and less reliance on paper currency. And we might go back, to the old Andrew Jackson philosophy that against paper money, just at the time is pictures being not being reissued on the $20 bill. Apparently, they're going to put on the $20 bill Harriet Tubman as opposed to Andrew Jackson. So I hope this is helpful. I welcome questions if you want to ask me questions directly through my email. Remember, it's Larry Bash, LARRYBASHE @AOL.com. Or if you would like to have a more in-depth discussion of it, we can actually do computer modeling and show you how it's traded and everything, but it's hard to do it in this format. We would probably have to wait until we can actually get together and be face-to-face on these things. And as I say, I suspect that the interest that was expressed by some of our participants now is because they're seeing so much about the increase in value, dramatic increase in value, and the moves. I mean, there are places that don't accept cash during the pandemic. So, I mean, we're going in the direction of a cashless society. Our money is no longer backed by the gold standard, so it's, our currency is the strongest in the world, and it has value, even if it's not backed explicitly by gold. It has value because we have the largest economy in the world. Our credit is strong because of all our assets, and the other elements in the strength of our system and our currency is we have a system that resolves disputes, a court system. We have a stable political environment, and so overwhelmingly our currency is valued more than, it does fluctuate, but it's valued higher than the currency of other countries, and actually it's used as a standard to value other currencies. So you start with the value of the dollar and then get into the Deutschmarks and francs and other currencies. Well, I hope this is helpful. We'll see if we are going to talk any more about this. Remember, the next lecture is on trade policy. It'll be on Monday, April 19th, and then later on YouTube. And we are going to, at the request of people who had asked for the subject, we will get into the issue of particularly our relationship with China and how that relates to our trade with China, the whole issue of having trade deficits, and the use of trade wars to resolve disputes that may not directly relate to trade. So I hope this was helpful. We responded to what the group wanted to talk about, and after this we'll have 4 more lectures. It's on the website what the topics are and when they're scheduled. I would also remind you that these 6 topics we have coming up, 5 of them came from people in the group. So you're welcome to make suggestions about other topics, and we'll have to decide whether we're going to continue with this format of using the public TV system. We're going to decide whether we're going to extend the program into the summer or wait until the fall, and we'll have to decide when we can do something so that we're together and have more interaction with each other. In the meantime, I hope this was helpful, and hopefully I'll see you on April 19th. Thank you.